This game is too hard. We need some help.
You big baby, why don't you suck it up and stop crying for once?
Actually, the barbarian is right. These dungeons are real meat grinders.
Yeah, we should pick up a hireling or something in town. That's a good point. I wonder if Gary the intern is available.
Well, yeah, I'm sure Gary would be happy to join you all.
Oh, come on, how many times? Hey guys, I'd be happy to help.
Yes, Gary's back. But who's gonna find traps for us now?
Welcome to the DM Lair. I'm Luke Hart, and I've been a Dungeon Master since high school. On this channel, I give practical Dungeon Master advice that you can implement at your game table. Today in the Lair, we're going to talk about how to use hirelings, followers, NPCs, and DMPCs in your Dungeons & Dragons or RPG game. I've also heard them referred to as henchmen or cohorts or retainers, but I think the first four categories suffice for this discussion. Also, in order to avoid saying hirelings, followers, NPCs, and DMPCs over and over again, I'm just going to refer to them collectively as allies. That should help avoid lots of monotonous repetition. And for the context of this discussion, what I'm talking about specifically is when the ally travels with the group and helps them on their adventures. I'm not talking about a random NPC in a town that just sells them a sword or something. Now, this is what we're going to do. First, I'm going to give you some reasons why you may want to consider using allies in your game, and I'll explain why not to use allies. Then I'll go over some best practices for using allies, including some common pitfalls that you should avoid. Finally, I'll delve into each type of ally, hireling, follower, NPC, and DMPC, giving you my specific recommendations for how to use each in your games. And when I get to DMPC, I won't lie, there might be just a wee bit of a rant. Before we jump in, I want to give a quick shout out to the following patrons and channel members: Malkuth, Abakai, Sophia W, Rainier the Conqueror, Trenton C, and Ironlord79. Thank you so much for supporting the channel and the other D&D content I create. And if you'd like to become a part of what we're doing around here and get access to some exclusive perks, there's a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can click the join button down below next to the subscribe button. Why use an ally? Okay, first let's take a look at a few reasons that Dungeon Masters might consider using hirelings, followers, NPCs, and DMPCs in their games. The first reason is that the game is short on players. Perhaps there are only 2 or 3 players, and the Dungeon Master wants to fill out the ranks a little bit. For instance, many modules are designed for 4 players, so it could be challenging for a group with only 2 players to run it. So the DM allows them to take on a couple allies to help them out. Next, the Dungeon Master and players might want to fill a vital role in the group that no one is willing to play. For instance, if having a cleric is really necessary and no one wants to play one, the group could take on a cleric hireling to tag along and toss down some healing when needed. Finally, the group might just need a little extra help on a tough mission or two, so they take on an ally or two to help them out.
Yeah, an extra barbarian or two is always a good idea.
Bad reasons to use an ally. Now, I would not consider using allies when you already have a full group. If you're sitting at 5 or 6 players already, then throwing in some allies is definitely going to bog the game down some, especially in combats. And also, at that point, it's not like they really need the help or should be missing any vital roles. In my opinion, you're just risking adding bloat to the game and slowing things down. Which is one of the main reasons that players whip out their phones and build dice towers, by the way. Probably the absolute worst reason to use allies in the game is because the Dungeon Master wants to be a player too. We're going to get into that little gem of a discussion a little later when I talk about DMPCs. But for now, let me just say, no, bad idea. Best practices for using allies. Okay, so let's say you're using some allies in your game. Here are some general suggestions for a Dungeon Master when doing so. First of all, run the ally in such a way that it goes along with the player's plans and ideas. The ally should cooperate with them and help them accomplish their goals. Please do not have the ally work against the players or even be difficult with them. You're not going to get any points from your players for clever role-playing. All you're going to do is piss them off and make them regret having an ally in the first place. And to a certain extent, we need to abolish the plot device of having an ally actually be a villain in disguise. Like, you could do that maybe once with a group of players and have it be clever and cool. After that, it'll just get old, and your players will become suspicious of every single hireling, follower, NPC, or DMPC that you try to sneak into the game. So use that technique very judiciously, or not at all. Next, since you have an ally in the group that is conveniently controlled by the DM to one degree or another, more on that later, you, the Dungeon Master, can use that ally to remind the players of common sense things they should already know. Now, why is that? Because players' skulls are dense and the DM has to repeat things several times for it to stick? Because what you told them the last game session has surely been forgotten by now? Because they sometimes think that attacking a town guard in broad daylight won't have grave consequences? No, not for any of those reasons. Pitfalls to avoid when running allies. First, don't reveal too much information via the allies. And what I mean here is that sometimes players will sometimes try to use allies as conduits for getting information and hints from the Dungeon Master. Don't fall for this.
Hey Gary, do you know which way we should go in this dungeon?
Nope, I have no idea. I'm just here to stab things and get shinies.
It's okay to have allies use their abilities for the party. For instance, a cleric using a medicine roll to determine how a dead shopkeeper died is fine. But don't let allies become information caches that your players can mine. I often like to play my allies as rather simple or brain dead for this very reason. Or I might just simply tell my players out of character not to try to squeeze them for plot information that they wouldn't have access to. Next, do not have an ally steal the spotlight from the players. An ally should not be the one that rescues the group from certain death, slays the dragon almost single-handedly, and drags the sorry PCs back to town for healing. As a Dungeon Master, your primary goal is to make your players shine and be the center of attention in the game, not a hireling or your fancy pants DMPC. This is one reason I usually have allies be much weaker than the players. Not useless weak, just not as strong as they are. Finally, do not give allies special treatment. Oh, your special super NPC traveling with the group always seems to escape death? Your awesome DMPC always manages to pull through as though his hit point pool is practically bottomless? Nope. That stuff is crap. Treat the allies the same way you would treat the characters, ruthlessly and without a shred of mercy. Alrighty then. Now let's deep dive into specific recommendations for running hirelings, followers, NPCs, and DMPCs in your Dungeons & Dragons game. How to use hirelings. Now, this is how I define a hireling. It's someone the party hires to accompany them on an adventure. The first thing to note about hirelings is that they are not morons. They know that the adventuring life is very dangerous, and the likelihood of death is very high. Thus, they demand payment up front, and they usually pass it to their family or deposit it in a bank or something for safekeeping. Or they might even demand an equal share of the loot obtained on the adventure. I mean, come on! They're taking all the same risks as the characters. Why shouldn't they want this? It's not unreasonable in any way, even though your players are probably not going to like it. Oh, and if the PCs get a reputation for not giving hirelings their cut of the profit, or mistreating them, or having too many of them die, guess what? Nobody is going to want to work with them. What, they just expect to churn through hirelings like a meat grinder and have an endless supply? No one is that stupid, not even measerly hirelings. Next, I make hirelings weaker than the PCs, but not so weak that they are completely useless, because then why have them? I feel like about half the PC's level is about right. So, the hirelings have roughly half the hit points and have half the damage output. Hireling spellcasters have access to spells half as powerful as the PCs. What I usually do is pick a non-player character stat block from the back of the monster manual, Volo's Guide to Monsters, or Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, and then I tweak it as needed to hit the stats and abilities I'm aiming for. Here's an example of a hireling from my Ancient Dragon game that I run my patrons. I basically started with the Druid stat block and then tweaked it. One of the things I did was get rid of most of the spells and just pick 3 that she has access to. And instead of using spell slots, I gave her a certain number of uses per day. This simplified things for me when I'm running her. I also wrote a quick summary of all of her abilities down on this 3x5 card so I wouldn't have to look anything up. You see, when I run her in combat, my goal is to do it quickly and bog the game down as little as possible. Now, I prefer to run hirelings 100% myself, both in combat and out of combat. However, I think it would be perfectly fine to have your players run a hireling in combat to remove some of the burden from the game master. Out of combat though, I think the dungeon master should be role-playing the hireling. And in all honesty, that usually means not doing much and taking the back seat, only speaking up when the players specifically address the hireling or need them to do something. Now here's something to consider too. Should the hireling get a share of the experience points from defeating monsters in the game? Honestly, I think a good argument could be made for hirelings getting a share of the XP. However, my style as a Dungeon Master is not to screw my players over, and I feel like there's definitely an element of that at play if they are losing out on XP when they have a hireling. There's also the fact that the hireling isn't as powerful as they are and doesn't contribute as much. At the end of the day, I use milestone experience points, so I don't really have to worry about this, but if I didn't, I would just give my players their full cut of experience points and call it a day. In other words, I'm not going to screw my players out of their experience points because they have a hireling with them. They can keep their experience points. It's not going to break my game. Okay, now we're going to jump into followers and NPCs, and these are going to go a lot quicker because many elements of running them at the table are the same as with hirelings. How to use followers. First, let's define followers. These are people that follow the characters or a particular character out of loyalty or some other motivation. They might be followers or retainers from a specific system like Matt Colville's Strongholds and Followers, or interns if you're running an Acquisitions Incorporated style of game, something I highly recommend, by the way. In fact, I have a video on my channel on the benefits of running an Acquisitions Incorporated style of game. If you want to check it out, just click this card right here. The first thing to note about followers is that they join the party for their own reasons, or due to a game mechanic, and thus don't expect any payment. An example of this is Gary the Intern.
Yeah, I'm just looking to advance my career up the corporate ladder. No pay needed.
For followers, I make them about half as weak as the PCs and pick a stat block from one of the core rulebooks, tweaking it as needed. I usually run them in combat and out of combat, but I think it'd be fine for players to run them in combat. And remember too, that followers who aren't treated well by the characters might very well say screw it and leave the party. In fact, because they are there for reasons other than payment, they might bugger off even faster and easier than hirelings. And if the party gets a reputation for not treating followers well or having them die all the time, pretty soon no one will want to follow them. So it might be a good idea for characters to even raise them from the dead when they die. How to use NPCs. An NPC in the context of this discussion is someone who accompanies the party for a limited time, often just for a mission or two, for personal motivations, and often as part of the storyline the Dungeon Master creates. Now, NPCs are much the same as hirelings with these important distinctions. First, an NPC might be of a similar power level as the PCs, but be very careful not to steal the spotlight. In fact, it's probably safer to make them weaker than the PCs, and certainly don't make them stronger. This is dangerous, and it will make your players feel small. Next, I always run NPCs both in combat and out of combat. NPCs are far more important than hirelings and followers, so I feel like the DM should always control them. Now, yes, by a strict definition, outside of the context of this discussion, both hirelings and followers are NPCs too. Remember, these are categories I've created so we can talk intelligibly about this topic. I'll just leave the nitpicking semantics for the comments section down below. How to use DMPCs. Okay, where do we even start with our beloved DMPCs? Let's just define them first, shall we? A DMPC is a full-blown PC with a character sheet and everything that the Dungeon Master themselves play. Usually, this is so that the DM can also be a player in the game. A DMPC is present during the entire campaign, adventures with the group, receives an equal share of loot, and levels up with the other PCs. Okay, so how to use DMPCs? You don't. Period. End of story. Thank you very much. Goodbye. I mean, they suck. They really suck, trust me. Okay, let me explain, Dungeon Masters. There are a variety of reasons not to have a DMPC. First, it bogs the game down because the Dungeon Master has to run a full-blown character sheet in addition to all of the other things they do during a game. And don't tell me that it doesn't take longer than running a simple stat block for a hireling or follower. I've done it before, so I know. There is a reason that Wizards of the Coast published Creatures in the Monster Manual in stat block form, to make it easier and faster for the DM to run monsters at the game table. Next, the Dungeon Master has conflicting interests when they are both the DM and a player. It's extremely difficult to be impartial and unbiased when you're straddling the Dungeon Master screen. Pick one side and be done with it. Which leads me into our next point. It's even easier with the DMPC for the Dungeon Master to steal the spotlight from their players. The DMPC often becomes super powerful and awesome and gets all of the cool loot in the game. I mean, come on. How many times have you played in a game where the Dungeon Master did exactly this? Okay, maybe you haven't, but the point remains, it's a huge temptation and danger. Oh, and have I mentioned plot armor yet? That's right, the DMPC never seems to be in danger or die. I wonder why. Could it be the Dungeon Master is protecting their precious DMPC from Mr. Death? Remember what I said about conflicting interests? This is one of them. Now, I have used DMPCs before, so it's not like I'm Mr. Holy Britches or anything, but I shouldn't have, and now I realize that. Let me know your tips for running allies in the game. Next week, we'll go over 10 ways to keep your D&D group from falling apart, but until then, click right here to learn how to run downtime in your games. And until next time, let's play D&D.